All right, we are live. Welcome back to Swan Signal Live, episode 22. I'm hyped for this one, guys. We've got Cory Klippsten, founder of Swan, and Robert Breedlove, writer of some fantastic pieces and CEO, CIO of Parallax Digital. But before we get into the episode, I want to let you guys know what we've done here at Swan. Swan Bitcoin is, of course, the producer of this podcast, and we have built the best way to accumulate Bitcoin slowly and surely over time with automatic recurring buys. It's really simple. You just connect your bank account and auto fund USD. We automatically stack Bitcoin for you, and then you can set up automatic withdrawals to your wallet if you'd like to do so. We do that with very low fees for recurring purchases in the industry. Absolutely low fees, as low as we can get them, 57% lower than Cash App and 80% lower than Coinbase. So if you are on Coinbase making recurring or one-time purchases right now, absolutely get yourself over to Swan and save yourself some money, some sats. You can also join our referral program, the Swan Force. When you join Swan Force, you'll get a custom URL and a landing page. You can put a message there. You can put your beautiful face there, or an avatar. And each person you refer will get $10 of free Bitcoin, and you will stack 25% of Swan's fees for 3 years. It is a fantastic deal. You can get out there and get paid to recruit new Bitcoiners. All right, let's get into this episode. Welcome, Cory. How's it going, man?
It's great to be here, and I'm ecstatic to be on here. Haven't been on in a while, so good to take the time, and I'm glad that I get to hang with Rob on this one. It's going to be awesome.
Awesome. Rob, how you doing, man?
Doing good, Brady. Nice to see you, Cory, and glad to be here again.
All right. We've got a lot to get into today. Both of these guys are huge Taleb fans, have studied the material thoroughly, and we will be getting into some of the ideas and philosophies of Nassim Taleb today. But first, we'd like to dive into Rob's most recent piece, Masters and Slaves of Money. And this is really an exploration of an idea that Rob had laid out already for us in lots of tweets and has been talking about on podcasts and shows. It is that basically the Fed Reserve and the Fiat regime amounts to time theft. And so, Rob, I'll let you take it away and talk about this masterpiece of writing that you have put together here for us.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's really commonly misunderstood. People think inflation is sort of a natural phenomenon in an economy. And, those of us that are deeper into Bitcoin, I think, clearly understand inflation for what it is. It's a mode of theft. And it's also, I like to say that counterfeiting is the illegal form of inflation, and inflation is the legal form of counterfeiting. They're the same thing. You're producing basically a redemption certificate for what was money, like it was for gold, and that redemption was revoked over time. So this has a really perverse consequence in that it creates those that monopolize the production of money basically become de facto currency counterfeiting operations. So the piece goes deep into that. It goes through a probably familiar history with agri-beads that was explored in the Bitcoin standard. It also discusses another ancient form of money called panos, which is a cloth strip form of money used in ancient Africa as well. And in both instances, they were essentially technologically disrupted by people that could produce it more efficiently. And a lot of people made this point that it was just a technological disruption, but it bled over into something much more immoral. Where they actually started to use the counterfeit money to acquire slaves, right? And it was panos and agri-beads specifically. Agri-beads later became known as slave beads because they were instrumental in the transatlantic slave trade. So I'm making the case that, before Bitcoin, there was this huge incentive to monopolize the production of money. And I think that's essentially the impetus for the existence of central banking today.
Cory, you want to follow up on that? Any thoughts in reaction to Rob's thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously agree, and it's a great piece. Thanks for writing it. I wish I had your stick with it attitude when it comes to writing, putting out these longer pieces, but I'm glad you do. Yeah, what you were just talking about obviously was reflected in your piece, and it also reminded me of, I'm still making my way about halfway through the ethics of money production. And so if somebody's looking for another leg down the rabbit hole on that, I highly recommend that book. I think Stefan Livera initially recommended it to me. But it's really, really well done. It's an easy read, and it lays out this case very clearly as well. But yeah, I think we're headed toward a much more just world, wresting control of the printing press away from governments, or at the very least, providing a check on their excess because of the threat of exit, financial exit from their populace. So that's, I often talk about a bright orange future, and we created a whole show about that. And that's really what I'm looking for out of Bitcoin. And there's a lot of different ways we can get into that.
Yeah, I make the case that money is like title to human time. So in the same way that a stock certificate is title to company capital, then money is essentially redeemable for time. And a lot of people have touched on this, like Nasir's written about it. I've written about it a little bit. But kind of understood intuitively from that standpoint is like, if you have access to a printing press that can just generate these tokens that are redeemable for human time ad infinitum, that you basically become a slave master. And through that lens, it's almost as if true capitalism were never even possible before Bitcoin, because there was always such a temptation to violently coerce and monopolize the market for money, that there was always a socialistic element to every economic system before Bitcoin. So I think we're really, like, the more I think about it, I think we're actually going to get past this capitalism, socialism framework into something almost entirely new, to say more pure form of capitalism, where no government or entity can actually, you can't monopolize Bitcoin necessarily. Like that race has already been run. There are people that hold a large portion of the network, but you can't monopolize its production and you can't manipulate its supply. And that's just a game changer for human organization.
I love this idea that Bitcoin will settle, like 2/3 to 3/4 of arguments that you had freshman year in college, where it just seemed like, well, there reasonable people could disagree about this. And no, it's actually, Bitcoin and its spread is going to create all sorts of new facts on the ground that will just be accepted about human nature, about the way societies and economies work. And, there will be other edge case, areas of controversy that we then argue about, or, other things that are still left over. But so many big ideas will just get settled for good in favor of reality, in favor of, praxeology and hard money and, shared recognition, not shared belief, and all these different things that appear now to be true and will just spread.
Yeah, I love that. I love that Bitcoin's making the Keynesian versus Austrian economics, making it like a real market test instead of this philosophical debate. I think it's doing the same for capitalism and socialism. And it just, honestly, I think we're going to rewrite the books a little bit. I don't think that why the Austrian frame of reference is very useful here. And I don't think it fully captures what Bitcoin represents. There's never been something that just completely breaks the incentives for violence, more or less. And I think, we've touched on it a million times, but the book, The Sovereign Individual, probably paints the best prospect for what that could look like, but we really have no idea. Like, I think this will be regarded as a neo enlightenment or renaissance type event, 500 years down the road. So I know Brady touches on that a lot, but I think it's pretty apt.
Yeah. I mean, the dawn of the Bitcoin Renaissance, and I think it is, it's true. I think it's a huge claim. But like we talk about a lot here as Bitcoiners, money is the foundation of society. And if the foundation is shaky, if it is able to be manipulated and debased, then you have, ripple effects through the rest of society and, human behavior. And collectively that leads to societies that are not optimal. And certainly not capable of producing a Renaissance-like era. So I think, yeah, with Bitcoin, we'll see individual and collective changes that will lead to a renaissance of sorts in the coming decades and centuries.
Great. I could maybe jump in a little bit. So I mentioned that agri-beads, which came to be known as slave beads at Panos, they were instrumental in this transatlantic slave trade. And just to give you an idea from a quantitative standpoint, how big of a deal this was. So the data that I found, it was a 365-year episode, essentially. And there were over 12.5 million human lives basically stolen. This is direct theft, right? So 12.5 million people left the shores of Africa and landed on European or American shores to become slaves. This all occurred between the years 1501 and 1806. And that number does not include all of the second order consequences, right? Like clearly they had kids when they came here who were born into slavery and all this. So just looking at it from an hours standpoint, which I use to draw comparisons to other systems of slavery, if you assume that every slave labors about 5,000 hours each year and they have a roughly 40-year working life, we're talking about over that 365-year period, 6.8 billion human hours stolen per year for 365 years straight, for a total time theft of 2.5 trillion hours. So it's just a massive atrocity. And again, that doesn't include their kids and all. It's really sick, and it was all made possible or facilitated because of this ability to violently coerce and monopolize money. At the end of the day, had there been something like a Bitcoin back then, which clearly was not possible, it would have drastically reduced the incentives for any type of operation like that to be carried out. There would have been no economic disruption that would have led to this usurpation of their human time, a form of slavery. So it's disgusting, and I think Bitcoin, as I draw later similarities to the central bank system that we operate under today, right? If you can print money that everyone else is forced to use, you're effectively confiscating their time. So while it's a less overtly violent and visible system of time theft, it's the same type of mechanism, essentially. And terribly, when you actually run the numbers, it's much larger scale on a per year basis. We're talking, I think the numbers were 23.5 billion hours stolen per year for the past 40 years by just the Fed. That's not looking at other central banks. And that calculation was done by taking the average annual wage rate and then the annual changes in M2. So how much human time was the Fed printing, essentially? And it's just interesting. That's why I think the moniker pyramid scheme for fiat currency is correct, because it is this hierarchical system of network marketing where the monopolists at the top are basically confiscating wealth from those lower down. And we've seen systems like that in the transatlantic slave trade. We saw systems like that with the actual construction of the Great Pyramids. And to me, it's just the deeper I look, the more I see Bitcoin as something fundamental to breaking this habit, if you want to call it, of people enslaving people. It just sort of breaks the whole method of it.
Carry this forward to like the last 4.5 months, and like obviously we've seen a massive acceleration of money printing and handouts, and it's already almost an order of magnitude larger, almost 10x what it was in 2008, 2009. Why have we not seen massive protests over this? Why have sort of the populace not learned their lesson about where this goes? What has the government pulled off this time around that let them get away with money printing to this degree? The 6 to 8 trillion on the road to upper double-digit teen trillions over the next year. How'd they get away with it this time?
I think we would all agree here that the true nature of money is there's a deep ignorance surrounding it, right? I said this the other day, that gold is a tool so old that many of us forgot why it even became money, right? So most people think today that the government paper in their pocket is money, but as we all know, it's just basically an uncollateralized debt undergoing slow motion default while it's being forced on the population. And I think this time, like they've always been able to pull the wool over people's eyes because it just sounds good. I think printing money, sure. How would more money not solve the problems we're having in the economy, right? When there's a liquidity crisis or a debt crisis, like money solves those things in sort of a first order thought process. But again, I think in the digital age, I think people are wising up to this a little bit. A lot of this awareness is centered around the Bitcoin movement. But this time we did see helicopter money, right? We did see the checks going directly to people with Trump's signature for $1,200. I think they're just preying on ignorance, as they always have. But now the monetary and fiscal response has become increasingly exotic. So I think the last I looked at the numbers was that $3 trillion expansion equaled roughly 130, over 130 million households, was roughly $46,000 per U.S. household. And each U.S. household got an average of $2,400. So the delta there, 46,000 less 2,400 went to Washington and Wall Street. And they're just, I think they're just buying passivity and preying on ignorance. But I hold out hope for the digital age. I think people are going to wise up to this. And I make the point in the essay that centralized currency counterfeiting operations, they just cannot stand the constantly galvanizing gaze, which is ever present in the digital age. I think people just learn a lot faster, right? But I guess the verdict's still out on that one.
Yeah, we're definitely entered a bread and circuses stage of the empire. Don't know if we'll stay here and make it worse and go to collapse or bounce back and sort of recover something. I think, in the middle of all of the noise, even if you took Bitcoin out of the equation, the U.S. system in particular has proven to be pretty resilient and, may have found its way back from the abyss and not go full Roman, let's say. But it does seem like we're in that stage. Like we're arguing over things at the periphery. They've been doing handouts like crazy. They found an incredible mechanism by which to end run the money printing, which was to use the commercial banks to hand out the money directly to small businesses. And, essentially everybody's complicit and can't complain about the handouts to the banks and the private equity firms and Citadel and whatever else, because they're sitting there with their other hand and actually taking the money. So almost nobody really has the moral authority to complain about the money printing right now, because they are, as you noted, distributing it, and that money is meaningful, even though it's only 5 to 10% of what the banks are getting. So it was a genius move. It's essentially the same move that you see with anyone that wants to just bribe some people with a little bit and then go and do something horrible over there off screen. But it does appear that there's never been a system in history that something like this, long-term technological effects leading to deflation aside, this will lead most likely to near-term inflation. It's just, you saw the Fed news came out this week, and it seems like people are kind of pointing toward like a 4% sort of target. Try to deflate this dollar away or inflate this dollar away and make our debts easier to pay off, because there's no other way out. They can't let the assets deflate, and they're just going to try to keep this thing on the rails somehow.
That's right. Yeah, it's the fiat currency pyramid scheme is a debt-based system, and you have to feed it more and more leverage to keep it sustainable over time. And that's been the life history of every fiat currency to date, right? It just inflates slowly, ideally for a long time, and then finally it explodes in hyperinflation. But I think you're touching on something else that's interesting that actually is favorable for the dollar, is this fiat currency system we have worldwide it incentivizes debt accumulation, right? Because real debt burdens are slowly being eroded by inflation. And that's sort of what created the Eurodollar system, right? So we have this second order dollar derivative system, if you will, worldwide, where people have created these dollar denominated debts um, to finance themselves, to not be exposed to lesser currencies. And this has created a ton of demand for dollars. So that when we see these situations where like a COVID strikes and economic activity collapses, the demand for dollars actually escalates because people are trying to fly to safety. There's less dollars to service debts. There's less revenues to cover debts. So I actually think that the euro dollar system sort of constrains inflation to a great degree, but which gives the Fed this false sense of security to print into it, where they're pedal to the metal, so to speak, on currency counterfeiting or US M2 production, which, to give you an idea of the numbers, I think the last 3 trillion, we've produced 3 trillion in the past 4 or 5 months. The 3 trillion prior to that took us 4 years. So we've accelerated, 12x roughly on US M2 production. And that demand for dollars globally in the euro-dollar system, I think will keep the US dollar viable for longer than it otherwise would. But it's just like, Hemingway said about bankruptcy, or every fiat currency sort of goes. It's gradually then suddenly. And who knows where that tipping point is. But it doesn't seem like you could keep economic activity muted for much longer and not see just gigantic inflationary pressures, which, absent Bitcoin, they would have probably been able to keep the scam going. But now that there's a barometer, right, a true barometer that's not being manipulated like gold is, and an exit hatch, the behind door B, if you will, I think this decade is going to be defining for Bitcoin. This is what it's been designed for. This is what we've all been kind of beating the drum about for years. It's like, watch out for this type of event. Global pandemic notwithstanding, but whatever the event was that triggered the collapse. And here we are. So, yeah, I think it's a very exciting time to be in the space, and I think you guys are in a great space.
Yeah. I actually want to poke at the COVID notwithstanding element, and I think this will be a nice bridge into getting into some Taleb with you, because the system's response and how it's played out with the pandemic is really just exposing how fragile the system was to begin with. And this goes for politics, this goes for our infrastructure, this goes for, CDC and WHO. This goes for, how decisions are made sort of at the top down, and the confusion between states and federal, and, the willingness of a population to, band together and wear masks or not for whatever reason, things like that. We've shown by the drop in GDP in Q2, if you want to just use numbers, that our system was very fragile to not even a black swan, something that was bound to happen and isn't even anywhere close to the worst it could have been. This thing could have been more virulent. It could have had worse effects. It could have affected young people more. Like, this isn't even the worst pandemic that you could conceive of by a long stretch. And it's done this kind of devastation to, the US and our economy. So I don't like to divorce it. I think it's just a symptom of a fragile system that, was ignoring these shocks and just surfing along with our 2% or 3% or 1.5% for the last decade, GDP growth, ignoring the fact that, we were essentially short a call option, basically. Mm-hmm. The pandemic was going to be able to cash that in and just like stop us out really hard at some point, and that it was predictable that could happen. And this is the type of stuff that, Taleb loves to talk about. So how do you sort of view the events of the past 6 months? It's actually been, 6 months basically since Taleb's first research that he put out about COVID and likely impact on the global economy in late January. How do you see it through a Talebian lens?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's very clear that the economy is fragilized by the incentives related to fiat currency, which again are driving us into debt accumulation and away from savings, basically. And, just using your economic intuition, it makes sense to have a rainy day fund put aside for when the unexpected happens, as it inevitably does. But we've sort of perverted that incentive structure by trying to manipulate the nature of money, essentially. And I view the entire COVID situation as a highlight of the shortcomings of the top-down nation-state model. Um, Gladstein made a great argument about this, that it actually became a global pandemic because of the state response. The fact that China was muting the story, the fact that they continued to allow flights in and out of Wuhan, to I think the tune of 6 or 7 million people coming in and out of Wuhan while the pandemic was unfolding, basically gave it an incubation period to become a global virulent situation. So, and yeah, I think we're back to this, Taleb would call this maybe ancient wisdom or whatever, of just people need to get out of their own way. We need to be humble enough to recognize that we can't manage complex systems, right? The best we can do is try and position ourselves to benefit from the intrinsic volatility of the future, right? Over time, the unexpected happens. That's an irrefutable aspect of reality. What we cannot do is try and manage those changes. What we can do is try to position ourselves to benefit from the volatility and minimize our loss. So, as I think his general investment point there is, make sure the risk of ruin is nil, right? Always manage the downside first before managing the upside. And that 1.5% GDP growth we experienced over whatever the past decade, that's what the central bank is trying to do, is manage us to a number, right? Low inflation, low and predictable inflation, low and predictable unemployment, steady GDP growth. So we're trying to use human intervention to manipulate a complex system such that it has less volatility. But what that inevitably creates is delayed and exacerbated volatility, right? So this last liquidity sell-off, it was entirely unprecedented in terms of its speed and sharpness. Like if you plot it next to the 1929 liquidity collapse, it's almost an order of magnitude faster and sharper down. Like not sharper down, but faster. It was just so quick, which is a testament to how interconnected the world has become. So looking at it through the Bitcoin lens, I think we just really start to see the shortcomings of the top-down state, and the need for more localized dynamic response. Like another thing we saw, like in New York, where the guy was selling masks at a markup and the state came in and arrested him and did all this stuff. Like that's how markets resolve supply and demand discrepancies, right? Is through the price signal. If that guy had access to masks and he was selling them at a premium and people were willing to pay it, well, he was satisfying a want. But again, we have the state intervening, spending taxpayer resources to manipulate the market, even at that scale. So it just, I struggle to see where the state adds benefit throughout a lot of this.
So one thought that I have, and I think Bitcoiners have been talking about quite a bit, or even new coiners who come in, is a question that's common is, how can the government, the federal government and the federal bank, how can they help to limit the downside risks of natural capitalist cycles if they can't print money, right? This is the main tool, aside from like interest rates, to that ostensibly limit the downside effects. And I think this applies to the idea of anti-fragility and fragility, the belief that the Keynesian belief that we need to try to manage that downside risk leads to anti-fragility as opposed to the opposite side. Cory, you want to start on this one?
Sure. I mean, one of the good things is we do have hundreds of examples of local and national societies that have gone through long stretches of not actually irresponsibly printing currency. In fact, we had a pretty nice stretch in this country from foundation through 1913, 1933, 1971, whatever you want to consider your cutoff is. Where essentially the people who shaped the nation and laid down the protocol for the United States, were all pretty much of the view that we're lost as soon as the ability to print money just becomes abused, essentially. And in fact, some of them just were very eloquent in the late 1700s and 1800s about never going off of like hard metals. But it should always be that way. And these notes that we carry in our pocket that are now backed by nothing, as we know, if you hang out on Bitcoin Twitter at all, they used to say that they were redeemable for for silver, and that goes away, and here we are. I think you have the method by which governments have always raised funds to complete their operations, which is taxation. And that is what you'll go back to, and you'll tax people based on transactions or based on income or whatever it is, and you'll right size government to be held in check by the people who actually pay for the government and serve the government, and the government will not be able to steal from those people. It's just, inflation is just taxation without representation. Money printing is taxation without representation. We had revolutions over this. We had the revolution over this, and we need a new revolution over this. And we actually are in the middle of it right now, and we're all participants. If you're on this podcast or watching this or listening to it, like, you're part of the Bitcoin revolution, and this is the best tool that we've had. We were just kind of lost people that were gold bugs, or the lone person in their freshman econ class reading about Austrians. You were lost and there was no path forward. But we do now have this tool that is perfectly fit for the moment and has everything that we need to get it done. And let's get her done.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly well said. The principles on which this country were founded are almost perfectly embodied in Bitcoin, right? It's just money that can't be stolen. It's a market you can freely enter or exit. It's an amazing technological manifestation of American ethos. And that's why I'm beating this drum. I call gold or Bitcoin monetary capitalism as central banking, compared to central banking, which is monetary socialism. And people get into the weeds about, oh, that's not socialism, this is socialism. But at the end of the day, I just say it's, capitalism means you have the rights to the fruits of your labor. Socialism meaning the state has a greater or lesser right to the fruits of your labor. And I think no matter, to answer the question about what can governments do if they can't print money, I think it's very important. Even when we say printing money, it's a euphemism, right? You're creating more debt, and what you're actually doing when you're quote unquote printing money is it can only do one thing, and that is create wealth inequality. It reallocates wealth from some and allocates it to others. You're not creating any new wealth. Wealth being like the capital we create, or in the process of economizing human action. Nothing new is coming into existence when you're creating new paper dollars or new entry at the Federal Reserve's database. There's no new wealth created, which is a very common fallacy. So in that sense, printing money, it can only create wealth inequality. Now, is that justified? There's a whole lot of nuance there, right? Who are you taking from? Who you're giving to? What is the purpose? But I would say in general, no matter which way you cut it, it's antithetical to capitalism. Because if someone has an ability to siphon wealth stealthily out of your back pocket, that's not engaging in a free market transaction. No one consented to that. Taxpayers don't consent to that. Users of dollars don't consent to that. So I like to actually say that, I forget the quote, every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. So it's like, I think maybe printing money has some usefulness, like essentially managing a money supply. Maybe it did, but I don't think it has fitness in the modern age. It just doesn't make sense to steal from someone and give to others. And something Cory touched on was there were experiments done with free banking. I think it was in Scotland, in the 18th, 19th century. And they showed a lot of success. It was just freely competitive banking. There was very minimal state control and intervention. It wasn't a long experiment because of some conflict with England, I believe, but there was some promise shown there. So we have a little kind of a test tube for what a free banking system could look like. The rest of it's just theoretical because, frankly, governments have always commandeered the banking system. It's the means of control. And I actually say this in the piece that contrary to the common refrain that money is the root of all evil, or love of money is the root of all evil, that money is actually the root of all sovereignty, right? So it gives us the authority to act as we see fit in the world. So I think if in a hard money world where people are incentivized to hold savings, that wouldn't be as relevant of a question. It's like, what can governments do to resolve economic calamities? I think it would be much less relevant of a question because people would be figuring it out at the local level. Like markets would be adapting dynamically in real time, making do with what they have. And so it's interesting because it's people that have lived under this fiat paradigm for 100 some odd years. We almost have to question our a priori assumptions. Like, how are we, even when we say printing money, like, what are we talking about? Is that an actual thing that should exist? Is it morally good? We take it as the norm. You see what I'm saying? And there's a number of things like that. But yeah, to Cory's point, America laid down this protocol justly. That's what the principles of the country were founded upon. And the implementation of the central bank violated that, right? That's when we got back. We had basically respect for private property rights, respect for the fruits of your own labor in the U.S. That's what we were giving rebellion to tyranny to create a system based on that. And then we implemented, after a number of, I think, 2 failed attempts, central bank got through and instituted itself to get back to violating people's private property rights via money printing. So, I think we really are fighting. In fighting for Bitcoin, we're fighting for an American ideal.
Yeah, it is interesting. It was, it is the reinstitution of the monarchy, and essentially, they have the divine right to print money and take from the people, right? And do we have to do this every 150 years? Basically, hopefully, it won't take that long.
And you see, like I think Krugman on TV recently, these guys, they even present themselves as kind of the high priest of modernity, right?
Yeah.
And in their suits, they're talking with their fancy jargon, saying, "Well, we need to increase inflation here to tweak this and pull this lever." And it's all bullshit. They're all the translation is, "We need to steal more money from you because we overspent."
Yeah, yeah, and not only that, we we pulled consumption forward by about 30 or 40 years and gave it to ourselves today.
Yep.
To screw the rest of you.
Yeah, intergenerational dispossession, I think Taleb calls it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he's got some interesting points about we don't often talk much about society type level things, and I think it is interesting though. He had a podcast that he just went on to last week that I think you and I both listened to, where he just kind of talked about respect for elders and how some of these older cultures that have lower time preference and just have that passed down culturally with stronger traditions than a young country like the United States have. It's not even in the realm of discussion that you would have a conversation around like the worth of a life, or like let's sacrifice some old people so the kids can go back to school and things like that. Like, it's off the table. It's not polite discussion. It's not in the Overton window. It's just a cultural given in most of human society throughout history, that you look up to the elders, that you protect them, that you do everything you can. There's no price at which you would feel comfortable because of the shame and being essentially exiled from your family and your local society and having to move if you espoused the kind of views that we see every single day in the Western world now, in particular the countries of the Commonwealth and the United States. So it's kind of interesting. This is an aberration in human history to have this much disregard for our elders.
I agree. One thing he touches on, how he puts it in his book, he's like, don't listen to consultants, listen to your grandmother, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's almost like the wisdom that's been filtered through a number of generations tends to be more reliable than neo sort of, what is it? I forget what he calls it, but where you have consultants creating fancy charts and graphs saying this is how you should run your business, versus kind of just using common sense that you would have got from your grandmother. You're on better footing listening to your grandmother than the consultant. It's just mm-hmm. And I would argue too that that quantification of human life, like that itself is a byproduct of this scientism that we have. And it really is at the foundation of Western civilization that we view the world as material reality. We think everything is materialist, quantifiable, can be managed. That's why we're trying to manage the economy, manage the weather, all this stuff, damming, rivers. And granted, this has some, it's propelled us to a place that's unprecedented, right? Like we're having a Zoom call right now. This is an amazing technological innovation. It gives us the ability to grip nature and particularize it in a way we never before could. But I think it does come at a cultural cost. And when you're reducing human life to a number or a row on a spreadsheet, as he says, that the system starts to dehumanize and depersonalize people, right? And you get to that sort of Stalinist thing where one death is a tragedy and a million are a statistic. We all become statistics to the centralized planning committee or the state. And I like that argument as well, that when people try to argue about intrinsic value of an economic good, I'm quick to shoot that one down, which I think everyone understands that all value is subjective, right? It's whatever your aims and desires are, the tools and impediments along your path have different values based on what you're trying to accomplish. And that's always changing based on the motivational significance of what you're trying to do. So I always, especially in Bitcoin, a lot of these people come out of the woodwork like, oh, it doesn't have any intrinsic value. So you can just crush that one easily. I think Connor Brown wrote a good piece on that as well. But the one domain where I think intrinsic value is true is human life, and possibly, life more generally. Like I'm not a vegan or anything. I eat lots of beef, but I think we should try and respect life as much as possible, right? Respect our environment, respect our world. And it's exciting to me that I think Bitcoin has the promise of taking us back that direction, actually. And there have been studies done at the UN that once your per capita GDP gets above a threshold, I think it's like 5,000 USD, people start to become naturally environmentally concerned or environmentally conscious because you have the luxury to do so. All of a sudden, if all your needs are met, you're relatively comfortable, you're accumulating some savings, you've got a job you like, then you can start to set your sights on higher ideals, right? Whether it's an artistic aim or spiritual aim or environmental aim. So I do see Bitcoin as sort of reinvigorating this free market economy will actually push us back to a headspace where hopefully we can be more respectful of our elders, of life in general. And as I've said before on Brady's podcast, that's why I see this resurgence of ancient wisdom, right? Like it's getting us back to our roots, so to speak. Not just Bitcoin, but the internet more broadly.
I want to pick this apart just a little bit, because I think one of the most important things that Taleb by Fits and Starts is bringing back into the discussion is that it's not a choice between like economic success and optimization, or culture and respect for human life, or not maximizing everything through a super tight over optimized supply chain or whatever. That actually some of the biases and heuristics that the white paperback authors, the Thaylors, the Sunsteins, the Gladwells, etc., which was basically my world for a decade or more, going to P school and just kind of thinking about like how stupid humans are, and you learn all these tricks in finance, and it turns out that most of that literature is just basically throwaway. It's little tricks and fun things or whatever, but the heuristics and the biases and the way that our mind works, and the fact that we have two kidneys, and and that we generally care about our families, and all of these things that are sort of passed down through the generations are actually the best thing for the economy too.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a choice between one or the other. Not wanting to get stopped out and have to create new cities because you completely abuse the environment in the one that you're in is actually economically sound, to give up a little sliver of GDP growth today to make sure that doesn't happen. There's a million different examples like this. I don't know what it would have cost to just do certain things like keeping cash aside or not have it all committed or whatever it is. You know, these downsides when it seems like when assets fall, and we talked about this before, when assets fall, like it seems like the advice that you always see is like have cash aside so you can buy assets on the cheap. But what the cash is usually for 99% of people is not that. It's so that you don't have to sell all the stuff that you have into a
Right.
down market.
Yeah.
It's really the safety margin, the margin of safety. That's why cash isn't trash. And that's why I think it's just awesome that we have so many people, you know, buying Bitcoin now. And we'll understand it very quickly in this country. Like it seems like it's going to be pretty clear by, you know, this time next year, that while it's a volatile asset, it is a store of value. We've got the, you know, it's been above the all-time high in the Argentine peso for quite some time now. This last couple of weeks, it jumped above the all-time high in Turkish lira. It's about 10% over its peak in December 2017 now. So there are a lot of countries around the world with people waking up to, wow, that thing kind of worked, didn't it?
Yeah, 100%. You know, Taleb describes natural systems as, he says nature doesn't over optimize, which I think is what we, you know, the consultants and the, again, scientism of the world, we try to squeeze every last drop of efficiency out of every system in the world. But what that does is make you super fragile to volatility. So in a supply chain, right, if you've got one path, you know, super dialed in and it's the cheapest path and goods are flowing, great. But as soon as one kink in that chain is broken, then the whole thing comes unraveled. So nature, right, instead of just having one kidney, if one kidney goes out and you're dead, we've got two, right? We've got backups. We're sort of bifurcated in a lot of ways. And it seems to me like there's in a lot of domains, people are wising up to this, that nature is much smarter than we are, right? Um, you know, Brandon Quittem talks about this with the slime mold, right? That figured out the Tokyo railway system more efficiently than the entire committee of planners that spent millions of dollars and months trying to do. So nature has this, you know, the deepest wisdom. Nature, of course, it does. It's been around longer than any of us. By definition, anything that exists now in nature has, that strategy has survived countless generations and filtrations. Um, so I think we're wise to sort of take a step back, look at our social and economic systems, and try and mirror the intelligence of nature. And I think that thread is woven throughout Taleb's writings. Right? He's like, you just need to get out of your own way, get back to your roots. There's a reason we have all these heuristics. They've served us. They've survived for a long time. So you're kind of in that Lindy effect domain, where if something has made it this far, uh, that is testament to its utility, right? It's not, it's very unlikely to be disrupted quickly, which is, you know, interesting with the gold. That's why Bitcoin is so interesting, because gold is, in my opinion, the fundamental tool to human organization still, right? It's the, it underpins central banking. Central banking runs the world, right? You pull that carpet out from under central banking, all of a sudden it's much less relevant. And that's what Bitcoin is doing. It's a digital technology disruptive to this ancient monetary sovereignty layer called gold, which is just like crazy to think about. You've got gold's Lindy effect versus Bitcoin's, you know, order of magnitude superiority in monetary properties going head to head. And that's really, really interesting. And a little more broadly, I think, again, I think we'll look back on this age in 500 years as the, whatever, the digital renaissance, digital enlightenment. I think some people are calling it the Great Awakening. It's hard to see it when we're living it. Things just feel chaotic and crazy, but I really think digital tech is rapidly changing human life in a way we can barely understand. And, you know, Bitcoin is the latest and greatest test to the disruptive potential of digital tech. Can it disrupt the oldest and most significant tool in the world today, gold? Like, that's the battle being fought. And as we all know, the rabbit hole is incredibly captivating.
I have an interesting thought. So once the telephone became widely spread it became pretty clear that the telephone was like more important than the telegraph, right? Even though you couldn't have the telephone without the telegraph, it had to come first. And then once the internet came along, it's very clear that that's like a more important innovation than the telephone, but it never happens without the telecommunications network, right? We're, internet kind of born late 60s, kind of spread commercially early 90s. We're only not even 30 years since then, Bitcoin spreading. By the year 2030 or 2040, when we look back at what Bitcoin is, are we going to look at like that quaint ad driven attention economy internet and say, well, that was a nice little stop on the way to the thing that really matters, and
Right.
Bitcoin will just be so much more important than the internet?
I mean, I think we probably all agree that we think there's at least a strong possibility of that happening. Um, I maybe it was Safety that said this, that he thinks that maybe the internet will be regarded as you said, kind of a stepping stone to Bitcoin. Right? Bitcoin was one of the most brilliant ideas we've ever had, basically as a species. In this, and I talk about this in the piece, that market competition is a process of discovery. So we're constantly trying to figure out better ways of satisfying wants, and we're doing that by betting against one another, right? That's what your business is, and everything else. And the net outcome of that is sort of the best ideas rise to the surface, and those entrepreneurs that develop them, they have an incentive to sell them into the market. So the innovation becomes diffused, and it just builds itself in layers and layers. And I think that Bitcoin, it's probably maybe the best idea humanity's ever had. And I'm kind of looking into this now. I'm reading a bunch about ancient ideas, but it's really interesting to think about it that way. And then this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I wrote about this in the piece as well, that I think this is very important, that because we have monetary inflation underpinning our economic system, which is basically, as you said, Cory, it's taxation without representation. What I would say, it's just theft. I mean, inflation is theft. It's a non-consensual transaction. It actually has the interesting effect of corrupting the morality of market actors and market participants. And I give this example in the piece of the winemaker operating in a centrally banked economy. So there's a guy that makes wine, typically sells his wine for $20 a bottle. He knows that his central bank, say, just doubled the money supply to quote unquote save the economy. And so he basically has three choices. He can keep selling his wine for $20 a bottle, and he'll take a 50% haircut in post-inflation dollars, right? He can water down his wine or use cheaper ingredients. So start selling his customers an inferior product, but at the same rate, say $20, to preserve his margin. Or he can mark his wine up to $40 so that he receives the same value for his wine in post-inflation dollars. So because there's monetary inflation in the economy, even if he's a good, truthful, honest guy and chooses to mark his wine up to $40 and sell it at full quality, he's going to face competition with people that are willing to compromise on quality or water down their wine, such that inflation actually incentivizes dishonesty. It incentivizes you to defraud your customers. And this becomes like an infectious disease in an economy. And it really corrupts the character of who you are, because you're forced as a market participant to weigh your economic well-being against your moral integrity, right? Am I going to defraud my customers? And it could be very marginal and small. Maybe I'm putting 1 ounce in my whole bottle of wine. Who's going to notice? It's no big deal. But it's these little accretions of theft that sort of, and then when he deceives his customers, all of a sudden they're getting less value for their money. So they're incentivized to defraud their customers, so on and so forth. So again, back to Bitcoin being this major breakthrough, we've never had a monetary technology with a guaranteed 0% terminal inflation rate. And if inflation is the source of this moral cancer that's riddling our world, then Bitcoin could be this, not only a pragmatic breakthrough, but a moral breakthrough. Like, and that's getting back into the Renaissance, right? Like, what kind of enlightenment does this usher in?
A bright orange future, one might say. No, but it is interesting. I mean, I obviously have done a lot of work in corporate America pre-startups and pre-Bitcoin, and yeah, you see studies constantly and come across companies all the time that are just looking. They do both, really. They raise the prices and they try to cut the costs,
Right.
And then they also try to lever up as much as possible. And this is because that's the playing rules in front of them. Because if they don't do it, their competitors will, and they will get the talent, and they'll get the investors, and they'll get the higher stock price, and it all just kind of like they're playing the game according to the rules
Right.
that have been set forth. This is the protocol, and you're playing. And it requires you to go and put as much cornstarch and subsidized soybeans as possible, or corn syrup or whatever, and market the health of aspartame and saccharin, because those are actually super cheap to get it more sweet than sugar.
Yeah.
Even though they have horrible effects on people, et cetera, et cetera. And we've been watching this play out in the food supply, and with the obesity crisis, which made us fragile to COVID, for since the 60s, since they got a hold of the recommendations and stopped them in Congress with lobbying, and put out the food pyramid instead of the one that was going to say literally, the CrossFit paleo recommendations was what was initially in there. It was like, lean meat, nuts, fruits, some carbs. Yeah. They replaced it with all this snack food. It's just hilarious.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think from that starting point where you have the moral infection bleeding out into society, fiat food, that's a great one, right? We had this, again, another government pyramid scheme, by the way, right?
Literally.
Food pyramid. And the fiat food, like we're seeing now that these high sugar, high carb diets, they contribute to a wide assortment of autoimmune diseases. So if you look at the charts of autoimmune, like there's a many autoimmune diseases out there, and a lot of them go undiagnosed. A lot of them, they don't know really what causes them. So in the traditional medical community, if you have one of these things, I actually had a mild one at one point, and my doctor says, we don't know what causes it. We don't know how to fix it, but fortunately it's mild and you just kind of live with it. That was his answer. And so that got me actually into researching the carnivore diet, right, and paleo diet. And I was able to self-heal myself just by changing the diet. And so there's a perverse effect there where you've got fiat currency creating this incentive schema to defraud your customers, which leads to fiat food, which leads to autoimmune disease, the prevalence of autoimmune disease, which leads to this every doctor in the world shoving prescription medicines down their patient's throat, right? Just whatever problem you have, throw a pill at it. And we fuck ourselves up. I mean, I don't know how else to say it, but you just look at, as Taleb would say, looking at us moderns versus the ancients, we've come a long way in a lot of technological respects, but we have regressed significantly in many cultural and health respects, family respects, like the nuclear families being torn apart. It's very popular for us in Bitcoin to sort of root all this in fiat currency, or we say Bitcoin fixes this. But I really think, not to say that it's the sole source of all these problems, but it is a contributor to many things, many aspects of modernity that we don't like, but people don't yet understand. So I do think that is kind of the art of the game right now, is finding a way to articulate that and develop empirical proof for it and say, no, this is do you guys listen to the Weinstein podcast, The Portal?
Yeah.
There's this episode with him and Peter Thiel, and they keep going back to they're going down this whole gamut of things that went wrong. Somewhere in the early 70s, things started to get weird, right? Like administrators in the university were getting more polarized, and education was getting worse, and scientific innovation started to collapse. And all the while I'm sitting there thinking, like, how do these guys, these are supposed to be one of the smartest, two of the smartest guys in the world, no one has even brought up the fact that maybe it has something to do with the Nixon shock in 1971. And if you go and check out the guy's website, Heavily on Clown and Homeboy, what the fuck 1971.com, it goes through that whole data set. It's crazy. I think it's really crazy. And if it's even half true, we're going to look back on this whole fiat currency thing like as sourly as we do communism. It's a really bad experiment.
Yeah, I tweeted earlier this week about how I think that we'll look back, future historians will look back and mark this era alongside history's greatest atrocities. And Robert, you were talking about time theft, and we can only imagine the time theft that has occurred because of the inflation over like you said, over hundreds of years or so. Jeff Booth, who was on Swan Signal last week, and his book Price of Tomorrow, talks about how we should have been in this deflationary, technological deflation should have us working in a much different way, right? And much different hours, maybe not even at all, and dedicating ourselves to our passions and perfecting our artisanry. There's a question actually related to this in the YouTube chat from James, and he'd like to know, how do you think Bitcoin will change the way we work in the future? And I think we can also then talk about a topic that Cory wanted to get into about scale transformations, how Bitcoin will change the way that we scale, the way that our governance, scales from top to bottom, and maybe makes us more of a localized culture again.
Yeah, real quick on the deflation thing. I think Jeff Booth's work is great. I keep going back to the words because I think there's a lot of euphemisms in economics, and inflation, deflation is a big one, right? Many of us operating under the fiat illusion, if you approach someone on the street and said, hey, do you prefer inflation or deflation? I think most people just lean towards inflation. It just sounds better, right? Of course you want things to inflate and get bigger and the economy bigger. It's a growth oriented term when in fact it's, as we all know, it's theft, right? So deflation, I think in the same respect, is a kind of a poor euphemism for, it's just productivity enhancement. That's why we're all trading in the first place. Prices are designed to go down. Prices being the exchange ratio of any one good to another, right? Money being the most marketable of those goods, you would expect other goods by comparison to become cheaper over time. That means we're becoming smarter as a society. Our knowledge is becoming more specialized. So the fact that we've tricked an entire planet into thinking inflation is good for the economy is a testament to the magnitude of the con artistry of central banking, in my opinion. And I beat that drum because I think we have to fix the language. We have to get people understanding what this means. And yeah, to your point, that especially recently, technological deflation or productivity enhancement has created this giant surplus. And you see it like in things that are further away from the state or closer to a pure tech industry, right? Like prices of electronics and software tend to come down over time. But it's creating this surplus that central banks and governments are just feeding on, right? They've been feeding on it through fiat currency. I listened to that pod the other day with that woman that, I don't know her name, Sarah something, that's an advocate for MMT. And she's saying that—
Sounds like Stephanie Kelton, probably.
Stephanie, that's right. Inflation doesn't matter because every deficit, you're monetizing a deficit, but it doesn't matter because every deficit is someone else's surplus. I'm like, you're stating it right there. Entrepreneurs are creating an economic surplus, doing the real work in the real world, and then bureaucrats and central bankers are harvesting that surplus through fiat currency inflation. Like, I think we're trying to de-parasite ourselves in the modern world. That's what Bitcoin represents.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I think the gains from playing politics and playing social games are just going to decline relative to doing real productive work and producing goods and services that people actually want to exchange their highly valued Bitcoin for. More and more people are going to seek this hard money and want to earn it over time, or very quickly exchange, the remnants of their fiat for it over time. And it'll just get. It doesn't even need to take over. It doesn't need to eat Fiat's $90 trillion broad money lunch right out of the gate. All you need to know is like enough people need to know that they could very quickly exchange their fiat for Bitcoin, and their decisions of what to do with that fiat start to hit a Bitcoin hurdle rate, an expected value of Bitcoin. Right now, it's really difficult to pry fiat out of Bitcoiners' hands, because whether it's for a car or for lunch or for a date or whatever, because we have this expectation of appreciation. But that continues even if you just think that it's going to hold its value and, just go up by a little bit. Knut Svanholm is thinking more and more many decades out and has a great point. Like, even when Bitcoin reaches stability, it's going to grow in value a little bit each year, just along because it needs to serve the needs of, growing productivity, growing GDP. And that's going to be a positive feedback cycle too, because you're going to have, more productivity, which means a higher Bitcoin price, which means more money that you've saved for investing in capital. And, the whole system is more efficient because a whole globe is using the same protocol for economic activity. So even when Bitcoin hits, Murad's magical 10 million a coin, like it's going to be, 10,200,000 next year. In $2020.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we're headed. I think we're headed toward, the opposite of cash is trash. It's cash is king. And the hurdle rate for, the costs for malinvestment, because there's going to be nobody to bail you out, and because you're going to have given up some of your Bitcoin, is just going to make people think they're going to have skin in the game for real. Like, you have Bitcoin in the game.
Yeah. Yeah, you're restoring accountability to the economic order, right? And that's all central banking was designed to do, is heads I win, tails you lose, right? Like, you just take risk on everyone else's back and never really suffer any consequences or be held accountable for their decisions. That's basically how it works. And I think Bitcoin's interesting, and I go into this a little bit in the piece, but it's the closest thing we've ever had to economic perfect information. So I vacillate on this. I don't know if Bitcoin's going to take decades to play out, or if it's all going to play out this decade, especially the way things are speeding up now. Because at some point, if the price model continues to adhere to its prior growth pattern, or especially if it adheres closely to the stock to flow model for an entirely another cycle, the incentive to front run the anticipated adoption of Bitcoin becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Which Satoshi called out way back in the beginning. So I think that's a really interesting thing to keep a close eye on. Like, how closely is Bitcoin adhering to expectations over time? Because at some point there is an inflection point. And as it becomes more mature, the Bitcoin appreciation rate, if it's at total maturity, you would expect it to increase roughly equal to the value of the productivity in the global economy, right? So that becomes your new hurdle rate for value investing. So I think Bitcoin's also going to have this, bring us back to value investing, which is completely out the window today. Like, all economic ratios and prices are just completely distorted beyond imagination right now. And to your point, we talked about how inflation is infectious to the moral character of people, with the parable of the winemaker. But I think the opposite is also true, that if we move to a money that is premised on proof of work, that it influences your character. Of course, you become more accountable and harder working. There's no other way to create value in society than to do something that people want, to satisfy people's wants. You can't go out and get close to the fiat currency spigot and make a few politically favored friends and get a bailout. Like, you can't steal from people as easily. So you have to go back. You're incentivized to go and be an honest worker, an honest contributor to society. So it's exciting. And I think The other point I make in the piece is that, we learned in the 20th century that free speech is sort of the check on despotism, right? We have to have free speech such that we can let our ideas go to battle so that our bodies don't have to, right? We can resolve things in kind of intellectual space so we don't have to do so in kinetic space. And when you really drill down into what speech is, it's rooted in the logos, which is the Greek term for word or ratio. And in that sense, like, words are our primary communication tool in the intellectual domain, but prices are our primary communication tool in the economic domain. So I really think that we learned this lesson about freedom of speech in the 20th century in the intellectual domain, and now we're going to learn this lesson again in the domain of prices, which central banks have totally bastardized, right? It's a restoration of free speech to move away from a centrally planned monetary model. And in that sense, I think Bitcoin digs the grave for despotism, and it really is disruptive to the tyranny of central banking. And it sounds grandiose, but I'm trying to pick this argument apart every day. And one interesting thing I found recently is I used to Google and research Bitcoin detractor arguments pretty actively to always kind of see who was smart thinking contrary to what I was thinking. How were they formulating their argument? And I don't know what you guys are finding, but I don't find there's no smart people out there with really strong arguments against Bitcoin anymore. It's sort of become like, maybe it'll work a little bit at the margin. It's probably the worst you're going to get. So I see it changing the nature of who we are at a societal level, slowly but surely.
Not going to find any disagreement there. I did just have a thought, and I don't want to leave us exposed as being monetary theory total noobs, but we do have to remember MV equals PQ, going back to the Canute argument. And it could also just be that the frictionless nature of cash that lives on the internet just lets us whip these sats around the globe like way easier, and essentially velocity goes way up, and you don't need quite as much monetary value. So that is one thing that may play out in the far future.
I actually have heard that argument, and I think there may be some merit to it. But the one thing it will never do is reduce uncertainty, right?
That's true.
Money is an insurance policy against uncertainty. There will always be a demand for that.
I think we've also seen that, it's so good at job one store of value that you're going to have hodlers for the next few centuries, as long as we're still alive on this planet, and they're going to be sucking up more and more of the supply. And you may be running the global economy on like 500,000 coins that are actually floating around, and the rest are just being hodled. So
that's right. Yeah, there's an old, getting back to ancient wisdom, an old Jewish axiom that you should maintain a third of your wealth in land, a third of your wealth in your business, and a third of your wealth in cash. And I think we'll probably go that sort of direction again, where we have 50% debt to GDP. That number is going to collapse. And then maybe it works out to about that, like a third each, a third Bitcoin, a third land, a third equities.
Sounds good. Sounds like a good target allocation. Some of you have some work to do getting up to 33% Bitcoin, damn it.
Someone asked a question. I don't know if I answered it or not, but I forgot what it was.
Yeah, well, we were going to talk about the future of work, right? Like, how will Bitcoin change the way we work, and also the way we govern ourselves? I think Cory had on the docket to talk about scale transformations and how Bitcoin will affect those. You want to take it, Cory?
Yeah, we can just talk real quick about scale transformations and then just do a little brainstorm there, because I didn't prep thoughts on that. But it's essentially that the way we organize ourselves, or the way that functions are organized in society, are different depending on how many people are involved and kind of what the scope of the organization of the system is. So, we're all essentially like totally comfortable being socialist in our own home with our nuclear family, and close to it, with our extended family. Like, I just think of, giving my cousin a sandwich, is like giving myself a sandwich. There's just no difference there at all, right? But then you start to expand out a little bit, and maybe in your town, because you have to live with these people all the time, and you don't want to hang the rich dude out to dry, and put a target on his back. So you do something like pure democracy, because there's only a few hundred people in town, so it's like one person, one vote. Then you go like much bigger, and you get to like states and nations, and little by little, what you usually end up doing is if you want to do it right, you end up setting it up more like a protocol with fewer and fewer, less and less oversight and less centralized control. Like you can be a head of a household, and you can be a mayor of a town, but you don't want one dominant person dominating everything at the nation level, and you certainly don't want anyone with power at the global level. So, Taleb would say you should never have organizations like the WHO and the UN, and that any sort of, one omnipotent power over any aspect of the entire globe is just an absolute ridiculous undertaking that is bound to have second and third order effects significantly worse than what is probably like a misguided attempt at positive first order effects in the first place.
Yeah, we touched on that a bit earlier, where to your cousin, you're a person, right, in your home to someone else, and then as you scale out from that, at the extreme other end, you're just a row on a spreadsheet at best to the World Health Organization, or even your own federal government. So insofar as like, I guess Bitcoin sort of demonetizes those institutions that really engage in at large the scale transformation, right? A federal government, I think, becomes much less relevant in a Bitcoinized future, because there's just no way to adequately fund themselves, right? You've got direct taxation and inflation. And if all of the real services of the government are being provided at the local level, why am I going to fund a large centralized group 3,000 miles away to oversee things? I don't know that it goes completely away, but it's without a doubt smaller than it is today, because it doesn't have that avenue to confiscate wealth. And to make one of the other, this touches on one of the other euphemisms that I don't like, is it's very common in macro to call countries the sovereign, like a sovereign currency. Bitcoin's a non-sovereign currency. I don't particularly like that, because it only gained the name of the sovereign because it basically confiscated all of the self-sovereign money. It sits on top of a hoard of gold and silver and all these things, and that's what gives it the authority to act in our lives as it does. So sort of along the same lines of intrinsic value, I think that sovereignty, and this is consistent with natural law, that sovereignty inheres at the individual level, right? And then where we vote, what we buy with our dollars, we sort of contribute a piece of that to the institutions that make sense. But in the current model, it's just been, there's like a back door on it that we're being stolen from. So the other thing I think to look out for in Bitcoinized future is, all the things we've touched on before, that governments are forced to compete. That naturally forces them to have a better product offering, right? They actually have to listen to their customers. Again, that process of market competition, it incentivizes you to be honest. It incentivizes you to defer to customer preference, instead of being a federal government that dictates what's going to happen. That you actually have to listen to your customers, strange as that may sound, I know. You actually have to curate your business model to suit the people that are using it, right? To the self-sovereign actors that are engaging with your business. So I think we kind of tilt that direction. And then again, we've never lived in a world with something like Bitcoin that so dramatically compresses the economics of violence. Like when you're running an honest business model, and there's the economic incentive is to maintain a long-term relationship with people who are the producers of wealth, by the way, in a knowledge-based economy, right? It's like that's what's creating value in the world. And you can't steal from them. Like you can't go and conquer them and hoard their central bank. All of a sudden, there's a lot of downward pressure on violence in the world. And that's I would say that's the great hope of Bitcoin. It's just a more civilized, less violent future.
We have a question from Brandon Lane in YouTube that we can pivot to now. He asks, do they think that fractional reserve banking in a Bitcoin denominated world is a bad thing? And if so, how would you propose that we stop it from happening? Who wants to take this one first?
I'll take a crack at that. It's neutral in my view. You're going to see people try all kinds of different ways to organize banking based on Bitcoin, and some of them are absolutely going to try fractional reserve. But my expectation would be that the market will tell them that they want to see exactly how much Bitcoin they actually have and proof of reserves on chain, using something like Caravan or something like that, and showing exactly what their lending ratio is, kind of the way that it used to be. Like, you used to be able to see exactly what your local bank, you were usually like a shareholder in your local bank in your town back in the day, and it was a community bank, and you were fine with Joe building his house over in Potterville or whatever. Yep. Because you knew that they had plenty of reserves, and it was going to be fine. So I don't think you're going to stop that from happening. I think you'll just see experimentation with different models and different lending ratios, and I think it'll be much, much, much more accountable, because there will be no central bank backstopping them by printing more Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree completely. Rehypothecation and fractional reserve banking was only able to exist because of the poor information systems related to money, basically, right? You're just trusting your local warehouse guy to say that he's got as many ounces on deposit as he said, or your local banker that he hasn't lent out the same stash of money twice. That does not hold up in a world where cryptographic certainty is possible, right? So I think the market will decide. I'm sure people are already trying it, by the way. There's rehypothecation. I think shout out to Fire Haas. He ran some numbers on this recently that based on I think it was the Grayscale numbers and the Cash App sales volume alone, that it was almost guaranteeing that rehypothecation was already taking place. All right, that we've seen the net issuance didn't cover what was being represented. So you have to check me on that. But businesses are already trying this. But I think in the long run, you'll see those businesses get busted in certain events, right? Whether it's a liquidity collapse or a margin call that they can't make good on or whatever. I think those business models will be compressed, and you'll see things like, like Unchained Capital is doing the multi-signature custody, right? Where you hold a piece of the key and you can see it, and you can do all the things against it. I think business models that more closely emulate the trust minimized nature of the Bitcoin protocol will succeed. And this fractional reserve banking stuff will just get annihilated, because that's one of the core value props of Bitcoin is global instant final settlement. So why would you tolerate a fractional reserve bank or a guy saying, hey, just trust me, I've got the Bitcoin, versus cryptographically verifying, right? That's one of the big ethos in the space, don't trust, verify. So I think that the market will go that way.
Yeah. It's funny. I was just thinking about this because I had a quick little discussion with some vociferous young pleb Bitcoiners that were very angry about a token being sold by the gaming company that some of the liquid Blockstream guys invested in or are advising or whatever. And essentially they're going to peg their in-game currency to Bitcoin. And it's redeemable for Bitcoin at a fixed rate, forever, or something like that. And these little reservoirs of people taking Bitcoin supply, and taking it out of circulation, and essentially saying like, hey, take it to the cashier's window at the casino, and you're going to get some chips out, and you're going to play in your Fortnite ecosystem or in your DeFi ecosystem or whatever it is. Fine. Great. Yeah, it's the best asset ever. Why wouldn't you do that? Of course you should take the Bitcoin and lock it up or put it in a vault or whatever, and whatever you can do creatively to serve customers and deliver what they want. You've got the best form of collateral in the history of man to be able to do that. And you will 100% for the next half millennium see people do shady shit with that balance.
I agree with that.
And it will absolutely be up to the market and to the participants and to the customers to police that and to make their own judgment about, do they trust the person that says that they have this Bitcoin? And are you going to require of them? Will the market require of them to prove that they own the Bitcoin? And, you know, what are going to be the different businesses and services? And this is where my mind just blows up, being like a startup operator and investor. You know, all of these different pieces of infrastructure that have to be created to facilitate all of the different ways that the world will work once it's more Bitcoinized. And I just, God, it's one of the reasons I love Bitcoiner Ventures, because right now we're like investing in Bitcoin startups, but this thing flips in like 4 or 5 years and we invest in startups started by Bitcoiners.
Yeah.
You know, like, and it just goes bananas, because they're going to be the people that actually see the future, and they see where the puck is going, and their business ideas are going to be more interesting and more valuable and higher potential than anything else out there.
I agree. Yeah. You know, you're right. The incentive to rehypothecate does not go away. So you'll, in those, whoever can get away with that stuff in an in-game currency or whatever, they're almost certainly going to do it. And for better or worse, it's going to take the collapse of those schemes to sort of signal to the market that, hey, this doesn't work, right? And then customers, again, will start to demand certainty. We're a long way from that. So I agree. You're probably going to see a lot of the schemes being perpetrated between here and now, or now and then.
Brady, you're on mute.
Thank you. It's been an awesome discussion, guys. I think we'll wrap it up with a question from YouTube. This is from Boom Production. He's asking Rob, what mind-bending piece are you working on dropping next?
So one thing about Masters and Slaves of Money, I promised a lot of people it was going to be my 10-minute read, and it came in at whatever, 36 minutes. So my apologies. I am working on a piece right now that I hesitate to say this, but will be 10 minutes, 10-minute read or less. And it's got the tentative title, Our Most Brilliant Idea. I touched on this earlier, but I think Bitcoin might be the best idea human beings have ever had. So, and that's a big claim. So I'm trying to poke that and test it and figure it out, all in less than 10 minutes. So that's what I'm working on.
No pressure, man. That sounds like an easy lift. An easy lift, Rob. Awesome, guys. Thanks so much. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for being here. It's awesome to hear you guys riff on all these topics, and I'm sure listeners had a lot of fun as well. You guys can subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're not already at youtube.com/Swan Signal. You'll also find our new show, Bright Orange Future. Cory and his real-life bro, Matt Garrity, Gen X brothers, they riff on music, life, and cultural effects of Bitcoin. It's really different than any other Bitcoin pod out there. Matt is, not steeped in the echo chamber like a lot of us are, so asks a lot of interesting questions and brings that perspective. Plus, there's, lots of topics besides Bitcoin brought up. It's a really fun show. It's at brightorangefuture.com. That's where you find the podcast. And, of course, the YouTube, like I said, is on youtube.com/Swan Signal. And finally, you can go to swanbitcoin.com/Breedlove to get $10 of free BTC. Shout out to Robert Breedlove. And thanks for your support of Swan Bitcoin, man.
Yeah, thank you guys. You guys are doing great work. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Appreciate it, Rob. Thanks, man.